Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a frontline update for the 25th of January 2023. I've done the news and overnight news and other news section earlier. It's not attached to this video. There's too much to talk about and there's quite a lot going on the front lines as well. I'll try and be as concise as possible, but you know what I'm like. Anyway, let's get to the first area of the map, the northeast sector. So this is Kupiansk down to Svatove to Kreminna. And we'll look at it on my map as well, which is here. Now, Kupiansk there, Svatove here. We'll look at this area first. There's been some shelling in Kupiansk. Now, if we go to look at Defmon's shelling map, you can see that there's a fair amount of shelling across the borders, Belgorod, Kursk, so Bryansk. But look at the whole front line. There is considerably higher number of shellings reported right up and down that front line. It's quite significant, as you can see there. Kupiansk, Russians once again shelled Kupiansk as the head of Orikhiv Regional Ministry Administration. There is damage done there. That is nothing particularly unusual, but just to give you some sense of what that looks like. So Kupiansk is being shelled, and that is a little distance behind the front lines, but within shelling artillery range. Just to give you some idea of that, actually, because sometimes scale is a little hard to maybe know. Okay, you got 17 kilometers there from Kupiansk to comfortably behind the Russian lines, I guess. So you'd imagine that they could have artillery set up here and hit Kupiansk with relative ease. So that's why Kupiansk is hit often. It's a large settlement and a bit of a logistics hub. And indeed, that's why the Ukrainians wanted that initially. So if we look at the war map and map, you can see how important it is in terms of the railway and road networks that Kupiansk is the hub of. Okay, so now we look at see what no report says. So no reports, no map changes for the Kupiansk-Svatove line. Everybody looks at the battle towards Kuzmivka. Things change on a daily basis, and Russia actually counterattacks in this area, but the situation slightly changed in a positive way, waiting for confirmation. Cryptic as ever. A lot of times he says these cryptic things, and then they don't actually, turn out, or news doesn't really ever come through concerning those. Rebar, in their Chronicles of the Special Military Operation (brackets war), says very little to say about anything until it gets down to Soledar. So in the Kupiansk-Svatove area, positional fighting continues. Both sides are engaged in military artillery duels and reconnaissance battle. In the Novoselivska area, Russian fighters struck a cluster of enemy personnel with a precision artillery strike. That's all they say. They don't even mention Kreminna. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, so Rebar's a pro-Russian source. The ISW, which aggregates sources on both sides, has said that Ukrainians are reportedly continuing their counteroffensive operations near Kreminna. The fighting is ongoing in Novoselivska with the Russians mounting a counterattack there, and a repelled Russian assault near Chervona Popivka. A BARS, Russian Combat Reserves commander, claimed that Russian forces are continuing to use small groups to attempt to gain positions in the forest around Kreminna and conduct infantry assaults toward Kreminna from the south. So, and we've seen some recorded footage I showed you yesterday of fighting in the forest around Kreminna. So, okay, let's put that all together. So, Kuzmivka here. Novoselivska, as I've told you many times before, Novoselivska is on elevated ground, has the advantage over Kuzmivka, but Kuzmivka is being stubborn, and it seems to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to actually take that settlement. The Russians have thrown in some reserves recently, reserves, quite a few reserves around this area. So they are obviously worried about Svatove being encircled and taken, as they should be, because that is really important as its own logistics hub there for supplying. Now, the railway might be active from Kreminna to Svatove, but as it goes north of Svatove, it obviously goes towards Kupiansk. So they're not going to be using a railway to the north, but certainly road connections. And it's just important for that whole line north to south there. Let's have a look and see what other sense we can make of that. So as we come further down, not much else to be said about that front line. Chervona-Popivka, there is a repelled Russian attack there towards the west, and then there seems to be this sort of grey zone here. So my map doesn't necessarily accord with, it's somewhere in between kind of Russian and Ukrainian sources. Defmon has this whole area as kind of a grey zone here, where the red line isn't so much control of the Russians, but it's where that they've got up to maybe at various points. So this is how he would interpret that, and this is what it looks like as a satellite map. And he's got positions of geolocation on there as well. So the control is much further back here towards Kreminna. In fact, just on the outskirts of Kreminna towards the south. But there's geolocated evidence of Russian activity much further to the west. As you can see, he's drawn his lines, and they broadly fit in line with the geolocated footage that is available. And in some cases, there might be sort of little groups moving behind enemy lines, if you like, and that's nothing unusual. But essentially, this yellow section refers to a grey zone. So this is where lots of fighting is taking place. It is certainly more difficult for the Ukrainians, it appears, north and west of Kreminna, where the Russians are pushing for a sort of counter-offensive or an offensive to stop the Ukrainian counter-offensive. Down south, there's heavy fighting in smaller groups, as you've heard, in the forested area. Ukrainians have made quite a bit of progress here, but it is slow going. Okay, and that's really all we can say about Kreminna. Just ongoing fighting. Let's move down to look at going down to Bilorivka through Spirna to Soledar and Bakhmut. So just forgotten our reports. Synopsis of Kreminna fighting for control over Dubrova continues. The Ukrainians are dominant in the area south and southwest. So he's happy with the dominance of the Ukrainians in the forested area, and they are repelling certain counterattacks around there. So anyway, yeah, going to move further south now. So as we move down to Bakhmut, no news really about Bilorivka and Spirna, as I mentioned, but there is lots of news about everywhere around here. So Vesely, Rostelivka, there's fighting towards Mykolaiivka. Krasnopolivka has been taken. Bladatne is contested. Russians are pressuring Krasnohora, and they have moved sort of westwards through Pidorodna, and indeed around and sort of starting to go into the southern areas of Paraskevivka. So look at lots of text from the ISW on Bakhmut. I will try and give it to you as succinctly as possible. So geolocated footage posted on January 23rd indicates the Russian forces have likely made marginal advances in the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut, and geolocated footage also indicates that Russian forces have advanced west of Pidorodne and they control the settlement. I have already had them controlling Pidorodne, but that is sort of confirmation of that. Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces entered the southeastern part of Paraskevivka. So if we look at my map, I'm going to show you areas of Paraskevivka. So as we come down from Soledar, we come through Krasnohora, Paraskevivka. There's this garden center here that is now under control of the Russians, it appears, and Pidorodny down to the northern parts of Bakhmut here, and this is now all under the control of the Russians. So I'm just going to change my map offline. I just wanted to show you what it was like and what it will look like now, or probably looks like now. So these are the gains that the Russians have made, the northern outskirts here and into the southern areas of Paraskevivka. There's a garden center here towards a tire shop there. Syriac maps that's exactly what they have. They say the Russian army and DPR never mentioned Wagner forces advanced west of Bakhmutovka River, so they have crossed that river and entered into the farms south of the Paraskevivka town, close to the tire service crossroad. In addition, troops took control over Sovkozna Street and the milk factory in the northern part of Myazokombinat district. Okay, so that is going towards the tire shop junction there. They've taken this garden center, and as we come down further down south, they have made advances westwards here. That, by the way, that's the Bakhmutovka River, and that was a bit of a natural barrier to them. They have appeared to have crossed that now, which is not a good sign. And then this is the region in the northern outskirts of Bakhmut that they have. The Russians have taken control of. This is Sovkhozna Street there. That's where they've sort of come in and then advanced westwards towards this more major road coming down north to south. That is an increased amount of Russian controlled territory in the north and the northeast of Bakhmut. Just to let you know what Rebar's saying, in the Soledar sector, Russian paratroopers are fighting on the approaches to Krasnohora. Interesting, not Wagner themselves admitting that. So regular Russian forces are really active here to help Wagner in trying to get this big PR win. In an attempt to slow down the offensive, the Ukrainian formations blew up one of the bridge spans near Paraskevivka. They've blown up a few bridges over time, but this is a claim that they've blown up a bridge around Paraskevivka. I'm not exactly sure where that is. It could be this one here, over the river there on their way back, but it could be somewhere else. Not really sure. Um, and in Bakhmut, the Wagner PMC fighters with air support are slowly pushing through Ukrainian defense lines along Sovkovna Street. So I've just shown you that in the northeast of the city. Yeah, they're actually, that's pretty much that. They don't really mention, because it goes on to talk about elsewhere, because there's lots going on, Klishchivka in the south, but it's not looking good around there. So I don't know too much about the eastern areas of Bakhmut. Defmon says there's a repelled attack around there, but I'm not really sure about, Maximienko Street and which is just sort of there, and even around the Yopitny area. Not too much information coming out there, at least not that I've seen. Defmon says the AFU repulsed attacks in the area of Rozdilivka, Sil, Krasnohora, Bakhmut, and Klishchivka. The situation around Klishchivka is still unclear. Russia most likely have control of the town, but it's unclear if Russia have captured the high ground northwest of it. Okay, now I think they have. So this is what my map looked like yesterday. Sorry to go too quickly there. So there's Bakhmut. Not really sure about much going on the east and the southern areas, but in Klishchivka, I already have them controlling the trenches, and I took that from Russian sources. Sometimes the Ukrainian sources are a bit slow to respond to where they're not doing so well. It's just natural human tendencies, I guess. So Null report says Bakhmut, Russian troops are closer to Paraskevivka than expected. Okay, I've shown you that. They were visually confirmed close to the southern outskirts. The situation northeast is not good. I hopefully have communicated that. In Klishchivka, Russian forces were located in the trenches northwest. I expect that these fortifications are lost. Okay, so this is the north that I've already shown you, and he cycles through to show you that is is that the garden center I was showing you, and that has been there's geolocated footage there. And then we get on to Klishchivka, where you have the settlement there. He's got it as a grey zone around there, but I would probably offer the idea that the Russians are somewhat in control of the trench network there. So ISW says a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces are able to completely interdict Ukrainian forces on the M03 highway between Pirorodny, Paraskevivka, and Krasnohora. That's up north. As of January the 20th, so some days ago, and on the T0504 highway between Ivaniska and Bakhmut as of January the 22nd. The Russian mill blogger claimed that the T0504 highway between Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut is Ukrainian forces' last remaining ground line of communication into Bakhmut that Russian forces are not fully interdicting. But what ISW goes on to say is these G-locks have been within the range of Russian tube artillery for months. Recent Russian tactical gains around Soledar and Klishchivka have not granted Russian forces new capability to interdict these G-locks beyond what is already possessed. Possibly. I mean, I would say that there's going to be the ability to hit it with mortar attacks. You've got this other road, a smaller road coming in from Chasiv Yar into Bakhmut, which is probably somewhat more protected as it stands at the moment. But this road going through Ivaniska is certainly under an awful lot of pressure here. It's not looking good for Bakhmut. I would imagine Bakhmut is its days are numbered in terms of Ukrainian control. Um, but it is the question is, what is the Ukrainian strategy here? Is it to hold on as long as possible and bleed the Russians as much as possible? How much are they prepared to bleed themselves in doing that? That's the question. You've got then, you know, if you're prepared to lose Bakhmut, where do you set your defensive lines? Chasiv Yar is fairly important. You want to protect Kostiantynivka. I imagine you're going to be setting up some kind of defensive line around here. But we'll have a look at topography probably tomorrow to have a look at what could be the next place to set up there. But it's not looking good for Klishchivka, and I would imagine that the trench networks in the on the higher ground just to the northwest of Klishchivka has been at least partially um, taken over by the Russians, but it's pretty extensive around there, and that could be hard going for them. But they're going to be absolutely peppering that with artillery. So even if the Russians aren't in the trenches, they are going to be hammering those trenches for sure. Okay, let's move on down south. As we come down south, let's go back to the war map and map just to give you an idea of where things are. So we were in Bakhmut along this Donetsk line. We're going to go down to Avdivka now, where there's a lot of increased activity going on. The HIMARS have hit Ilovaisk again, which is a bit of a rail hub. I think it's either there or there. I think it's there. So that has been hit overnight. Don't know what damage has been done and what exactly was hit, whether it's just railway infrastructure or whether there were train loads with sort of APCs on and things know have been hit before, and that could explain the higher number of mechanized equipment that has been lost overnight. But okay, let's come down. There have been repelled attacks apparently in some of the usual places, Novobakhmutivka and Krasnohorivka. Repelled attacks from the Russians around there. Now, the Russians have claimed to have cleared out or taken various parts of, depending on who you listen to, Vodyane. I've already got that. I've already have them controlling the eastern areas of Vodyane. ISW says Ukrainian forces repelled Russian attacks in all the places I've said, and Marinka. Geolocated footage published on January the 17th and 23rd indicates Russian forces are likely advanced into the outskirts of Vodyane. A Russian mill blogger claimed that the DNR Somalia battalion occupied unspecified high ground near Vodyane and pushed the Ukrainian forces out of the settlement. Another Russian mill blogger claimed the Russian special forces and the DNR Sparta battalion captured Vodyane and cleared the settlement. So there's various claims as to who's done it, but the Vodyane has been cleared out. Russia control at least parts of Vodyane. It seems to be fairly consistent. There has been footage recorded around here of Russian attacks and them losing quite a bit of equipment. Rebar have quite a lot to say on this pro-Russian source. Stuff that I've already said, talking about the Somalia battalion. Ukrainian units of the 11th Battalion, 59th Brigade, lost a large number of personnel, so they claim, and retreated to the second line of defense. It's around Vodyane. To prevent a defensive collapse, Ukrainian command urgently sent in Marines from the 501st Battalion, 36th Brigade, 2 Mi-8 helicopters provided fire support in the area of Vodyane. The enemy expects a further offensive by Russian troops near Pervomaisky, Marinka, Krasnohorivka, and Nevelsky. The Russian armed forces. Okay, so actually, that's enough for there. So, lots of activity around there. Suryat map says north of Donetsk airport, the Russian army and the DPI forces took control over the hills north of Vodyane and advanced towards Pervomaisky from a second axis. So here, just to give you an understanding where that is, you've got Opitny and Vodyane. They actually have the Russians controlling all of Vodyane and north of there towards Shiverne. And attacking towards Pervomaisky as well. So that's quite a considerable amount of territory taken. And this is a quite important buffer zone for Avdivka. you really don't want to start losing that because then, okay, there are fields in between. That's a bit like a killing fields, but they are inching closer to a meaningful encirclement of Avdivka if they are getting control over these settlements along this sort of watercourse here. So Vodjani, it could well be, if Syriac maps is correct, and they've been fairly accurate on the Russian advances recently. If they are correct then and accurate, the Russians control this kind of area here. I'll wait a day or so just to see, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's true. However, as I said, there has been quite a bit of footage of of the Russians losing a lot of equipment in these assaults. So these won't come without some major costs for them, as we've seen in Bakhmut. But where Bakhmut is human waves and it's more about troop losses, actually there's quite an amount of equipment losses around here. That's kind of the difference. And then repelled attacks around Novelsky as well, Pervomaisky up there. And then we move on to Marinka, and it's the same sort of business. Not too much detail about Marinka other than repelled attacks. And then we move on to Vuhledar, which is back in the news. So the Vuhledar area is just this southeastern corner. If we go to the war map, we are looking at this area, and there's been renewed attempts for the Russians to do some kind of offensive. So the question is, are these reconnaissance and force attacks? Is this, as some people are claiming, including Russian military bloggers, that this is a new offensive brewing in Vuhledar? I mean, if this is a new major offensive brewing, then the Ukrainian response should be something like, "Is that all you got?" But if it's reconnaissance in force, and they've been, I think, fairly well repelled around here, there's another set of losses of uh, Russian equipment, mechanized equipment here, then what's that feeding back to the Russian decision makers as to what they're doing around here? It would be interesting to see. Russian sources, there's a lot to say here. This is the ISW, widely claimed that Russian forces launched an offensive around Vuhledar on January 24th. The claim was likely meant to generate positive narratives to distract from the lack of progress in Bakhmut. And they say that again down here. Russian sources likely intend to repeat a similar ongoing effort in Zaporizhia Oblast, where Russian sources have circulated claims to localize Russian advances without any confirmation, to distract from the fact that Russian forces have not made any operationally significant gains around Bakhmut. Well, I guess they have made those gains around Bakhmut. So I don't know if this is ISW trying to sell that a bit more positively, but those gains have been pretty small and at a huge cost. So that could be where the ISW are going with that. Russian mill bloggers claimed that elements of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade in the Pacific Fleet broke through Ukrainian defenses in the Vuhledar areas and advanced north of Pavlivka and west of Merkilska. Many Russian mill bloggers amplified Vostok Battalion Commander Alexander Khodorkovsky's claim that the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade took part in the operations, but he then edited his initial post, removing references to specific Russian units. Whether that be for OPSEC reasons, I don't know. And then there's apparently the DNR Cascade Battalion also participating in offensive operations in the Vuhledar area, and that Russian mill bloggers are claiming that Russian forces are continuing these offensive operations toward Vuhledar and also near Velika Novosilka. But there's not been any observed footage for the ISW indicating that Russian forces have launched a localized offensive in the Vuhledar area. In other words, is this a proper offensive? North of Pavlivka towards Vuhledar and from Mikilska, or is this kind of what we saw before, which are these constant probing attacks that don't seem to go anywhere? Difficult to say, really. The NOR reports have said Russian forces, including Vostok Battalion, conducted an attack towards Vuhledar through northern Pavlivka, ending up in a complete failure. So NOR reports are selling this as a complete Russian failure. Again, pro-Ukrainian, or who knows what. They do. He does show then footage of destroyed Russian equipment in that area. In total, 2 BTR-82As, 2 BMP-3s, and 1 BMP-2 were destroyed. So infantry fighting vehicles taking a bit of a hit in that area. And Rebar, on the other hand, talks about in the Vuhledar sector, exactly kind of what the ISW is saying, because ISW are referring to this source. At Vuhledar itself, Russian troops advanced from the west and south, surprising the enemy. Part of the garrison was withdrawn to South Donbass Mine Number 1 to recover from losses. Early this morning, well, actually, no, that's something else. So, and they talk about sort of activity around the Velika Novosilka area. So that's just to let you know that is just over there to the west of Vuhledar. So the question is this a sign of a major offensive or not? The sort of thing you might see. I mean, this is just an hour ago. Breaking, we are receiving messages about massive Russian offensives and breakthroughs in the cities of Vuhledar, Bakhmut, Avdivka, and Marinka. Ukraine needs more weapons now. And it's a picture of Vuhledar. I think that's probably over egging it, but you can certainly see that the Russians are putting concerted efforts into a number of places. So we've got Zaporizhia around the Orikhiv area, now Vuhledar being thrown into that, Avdivka, Vodyane, and Pervomaisky, and even north of Avdivka are under a lot of stress, really. Challenging, super challenging around Bakhmut and even perhaps north of Kreminna. So are the Russians, are they just putting lots of pressure everywhere, or are they brewing for a particular large offensive in one or two places in a more concerted manner? The reason why Vuhledar is so important is because of the railroad that's really nearby. So Tatrugami UA says Russian occupational forces have started their offensive towards Vuhledar, so he thinks that there is an offensive going on. I wrote about their preparations and significance of Vuhledar here, so he's done another thread on that, and in fact, there's reference to it just down here that shows you the railway line that's going through there that the Ukrainians do have fire control over, and that was back on December the 3rd. There is, talk here again. How much of this is true? Okay, so I checked Vuhledar. It's held to take right now, but the Russian forces are really close on the east and southern side of the city. But high-rise buildings are a problem. They need to be destroyed before attacking the objective. So, I talked about this an awful lot when Vuhledar was previously being attacked, which is that Vuhledar sits on high ground. For those who haven't watched me before or can't remember, Vuhledar sits on elevated ground. These are all high-rise buildings there. Okay, so they all have the ability you can put men in there with ATGMs. And you can have mortars, and you've got artillery peppering these guys, and drone activity. So that this incline up here just becomes, and in fact Pavlivka down below just becomes really difficult for the Russians to hold. So they did wave after wave of attacks on Pavlivka and just got beaten back because Vuhledar was on this elevated ground. So then you started seeing attempts for the Russians to take Novomykhailivka in order to circle around along the higher ground here, come down, so it's high ground along here, to take Vuhledar from behind. But that hasn't really materialized as they failed to make any progress around Novomykhailivka. So are we going to see a rinse and repeat of what we saw earlier, which is the Russians losing huge amounts of troops and equipment around Pavlivka in their continued attempts to take Vuhledar, or is there something different going on now? Have they got? They've got more, greater force to be able to break down Vuhledar? And that might then give them access. There's not a lot between Vuhledar and these other settlements. So does it allow the Russians to advance? Is this quite an important key for them? We shall see. Who knows? So it's all happening there to some degree. And then we've got Zaporizhia as well. Just to conclude there, so ISW says whether Russian forces are conducting localized offensive operations near Vuhledar or Russian sources are exaggerating Russian activity on this sector of the front, the Russian effort is likely focused on supporting this information operation and does not pretend a resumption of a Russian offensive in western Donetsk Oblast. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade was previously badly degraded during offensive operations in the Vuhledar area in November 2022. That's when I talked about it last time, and is unlikely to have the capacity to relaunch a new offensive on this sector of the front, reinforcements notwithstanding. Okay, let's move, as I said, to Zaporizhia. So in this Orikhiv area, you've essentially got disagreement as to what's happening, not just between Ukrainian and Russian sources, between Russian sources as well. Defmon says pro RU Rebar or Krybar, as he says, reported Russian 58th Combined Arms Army tried to advance in the area of Orikhiv but failed, and sort of takes a mickey a little bit. The Rebar, in fact, in their latest reports, doesn't even mention it. Doesn't even mention the Orikhiv, and they were sort of lauding that the Russians had taken 4 settlements. Now they don't mention it at all. A Russian ISW says Russian Ukrainian reporting indicated that Russian forces likely did not make territorial gains on January 24th, further undermining Zaporizhia Oblast occupation official Vladimir Rogov's prior territorial claims. Apparently, it's a slow pace of offensive. In fact, one mill blogger has claimed the quote offensive in Zaporizhia Oblast is unhurried, and that there's a slow rate of advance there. It appears, that no one's quite on the same page with regard to what's happening in Orikhiv, and in fact, it seemed to have certainly died down in terms of what people are reporting about it over the last day. We'll see if that picks up and whether the Russians are making any serious attempts at gains there, or whether it's just sort of reconnaissance and force type attacks. Okay, last thing I'm going to say concerns the Dnipro River, and there's quite a lot of talk about a special forces attack that took place last night. I'm going to show you a bit of footage. So, insane footage of a daring Ukrainian GUR assault of the Russian positions at Novokhovka to locate personnel, equipment, and command posts. Group successfully completed the mission and returned, having destroyed the post and 12 invaders. Commentary by the GUR on the events. Russians claimed all Ukrainian boats were destroyed, and photos showing the destroyed targets and stuff on fire. I'll show you the video of that in a second. So what the GUR say, the special unit of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, the GUR of Ukraine, with the support of the armed forces, carried out a night raid on the area of Novokhovka. During the night of the 23rd and 24th, the GUR special group with participation carried out that night raid. Initially, thanks to the work of partisans and the assistance of special technical equipment, scouts located a precise location of Russian forward command posts, and despite heavy mining and fortifications, the group crossed the river and established on the opposite bank. Having entered the battle with the enemy, the scouts scouts struck the buildings with grenade launchers where the command post was located. Having considered the landing to be a break through the lines of defense, the Russians immediately acquired combat reserves assistance, special forces, aviation, and armored vehicles. Thanks to this, the recon group obtained precious intelligence on the numbers, amounts, and locations of the enemy reserves. In the course of the battle, the enemy took losses. Our soldiers destroyed more than 12 occupiers, an APC, and took 1 captive. Having finished the task, the group returned to the right bank of the Dnieper. So on and so forth. So Reba, on the other hand, said earlier this morning, Ukrainian units attempted to land near Korsunka on the left bank of the Dnieper. The AFU sent 5 landing boats. 3 were sunk in the water. Those that landed were destroyed. 5 armored vehicles and 30 men. This is definitely not wholly correct, but it's difficult to know exactly what did happen. I'll show you this video now. I would love to show you the sound, play you the sound, because you can hear the sounds of what's going on in a lot of this. I'll play it to begin with, but music kicks in, and then there's copyright claims and all sorts. So anyway, this is what happened. It's quite dark. Can't really see an awful lot at the moment. Now, what's interesting about this is they appear to be firing at the riverbank. Whilst, are they on the way there, or are they going away from this? Is this at the end of their mission, or is this at the beginning? Because if it's at the beginning of the mission, then that seems rather bizarre that they haven't even landed and they're coming into trouble already. So yeah, not quite sure what's going on there. Let's just skip it on a little bit. As we see or don't see, they are now on the ground here. So it's quite annoying that they put music over that. And then you see some aerial footage, drone footage spliced in with this ground footage. There's a lot of heavy machine gun fire going on. An awful lot of small arms fire and stuff happening. There's boats. There's one boat there, 2, 3 boats. Doesn't look like any boat has been hit. 3 boats traveling away. I can see no wreckage of boats, but you can see that they are absolutely peppering the water here. Now we can't tell whether you see that boat is firing. So I wonder whether the initial footage is from these guys firing, but then there was no sign, and you see that explosion by that boat, no sign of the fire in the initial bits of footage. And then it's just some footage of someone getting some medical treatment on board that seems to have been hit, gets an injection. But I can't quite tell exactly what happened. But this is it. This is important footage because the Russians say there were boats that were destroyed that landed, and there's absolutely no evidence of that, at least from this footage or that footage. And then you've got the burning building there. So this is what was attacked. What I'm trying to say is that, both sides will be presenting propaganda. It looks like those boats were really under a lot of pressure on the way back. There's some big explosions by the boats. Did those boats make it? I don't know 100%. That footage has come back, so you're going to assume that somebody's made it back. At the very least, rebar are not correct. I would say so. 5 landing boats, 3 were sunk in the water. There's no evidence of that. Looks like there were only 3 boats and 3 returning, but again, I can't be sure of that. And 5 armored vehicles on those boats is highly unlikely. Those boats just look like ribs, rigid inflatable boats. I don't think that's going to be the case at all. And 30 men lost. I think that is probably nonsense, but that's not to say that all the boats that went made it back. There's not to say the Ukrainians didn't have losses. I'm trying to understand why there was fighting that looked like there was fighting on the way there. Anyway, that's the claim there, and this is in the ISW as well. But just repeating what I've said, they do add that the mill bloggers likely significantly exaggerated their claims of Ukrainian losses, likely in a further attempt to distract from the lack of Russian progress on the Axis. One mill blogger claimed that the Ukrainian forces conducted a recon mission for a future attempt to establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Kherson River, and warned that Ukrainian activity in the area will likely escalate in the near future. And in fact, Rebar talk about landing attempts on the Kimburn Spit going forward in the future, and in the area of Novokakhovka. Novokakhovka, just to let you know, is exactly there. So this happened around Novokakhovka. So there you go, Korsunka in that area there. So that's where that took place. Not too far from Kherson. That's the Frontline update for today. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's a long one, but so much has happened. It's all starting to happen up and down the front with regard to Russian attacks. Whether this is these are significant attacks, we'll wait to see. Whether these are precursors to significant attacks, even. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much for your support. All the ways you can support the channel are down below. There's Buy Me a Coffee, always appreciated. In fact, I haven't had a cup of tea yet, and it's getting on. It's been a long morning already. Yeah, all those ways, YouTube, thanks, PayPal, I appreciate all of that, but just being here and supporting, and your amazing comments in the threads are hugely appreciated. Anyway, toodle pips, and I'll catch you later.